In this lesson, we're going to create the geometry we need to be able to model all of the details into the outer frame. We're going to start by splitting this object up into just a couple of main areas or sections, and then we will break down those sections into further subsections. The basic idea is to create some sort of a layout defining separate areas where we want to add details. And we can then work on and refine one particular area at a time, which will make adding the details a lot easier. For now, we're not going to worry about a clean mesh or n-gons, for example. In fact, I'll be using n-gons quite a lot. That is because they will help to keep things simple for now. Eventually, of course, we're going to convert all n-gons into four-sided polygons or quads to make sure we get clean geometry that subdivides nicely when we use hypernerbs. So let's go ahead and cut this big chunk of geometry into some smaller pieces. First of all, I want to switch to my front view, and I need to go to the configure options and show my reference image again. Let's take a look at this reference image. We can split this object up into three main areas, and we can do that simply by separating the corner area from the rest of the geometry. So let's go ahead and do that. First of all, though, I want to go back to my configure options, and I think I'm going to add some transparency to the background image. Hopefully this will make it a little bit easier for you to see what I'm doing once I start working on the geometry. Now let's go to edge mode, and I want to activate my knife tool. And I want to add some vertical cuts here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch the knife to plane mode, and because I want to do vertical cuts, I need to switch the plane to YZ. And also let me switch off snapping here. So now we can add two cuts here. And I'm going to select these edges, and I want to change the size on the x-axis to something a little more even. Let's do maybe 8 centimeters here. And also I want to grab my move tool and reset the modeling axis to 0 on the y-axis. Now let's go ahead and zoom in to this area here, and I'm going to switch back to my knife tool, and this time I need to change the plane to XZ so I can add two more cuts here. And I'm going to select these edges, and I'm going to change the size to something like 9.5 centimeters on the y-axis. So now that we've created the three main areas, we can go ahead and create further subsections within those areas. And first of all, I want to separate this area from the rest of the geometry. So let's grab the knife tool again. And this time, I'm not going to cut right on the edge in my reference image, but I'm going to offset my cut a bit so that it is below the edge in the reference image. And let's switch the knife to line mode here and add one cut here and another one over here. And now we can select these edges here. Let's see, I don't think we actually need to move these. What I want to do here is I want to create a more or less even distance between the edges in my reference image and the edges on my model. Let's select these edges here and move them over maybe to the left just a bit. These edges here will be our control edges. Usually you would create the shape of the actual extrusion first, extrude it, and then add the control edges, but sometimes I just find it easier to do it like this, because now I can go to polygon mode, select these polygons here, and use extrude inner. Let's do maybe 2 centimeters here to create the shape we're going to extrude later on. And this also has the advantage that we're getting a nice and even polygon loop around this area here. Next, I want to remove some of the edges. So in edge mode, I'm going to select these edges here, And in this lesson we're going to use a couple of commands. So before I continue, it might be a good idea to show you these commands. And you can find them under Mesh Commands, and the ones we're going to use quite a bit are Connect Points, Edges, and Melt maybe, and Dissolve. Over here on the right you can see the shortcuts. There are no default shortcuts for Connect Points, Edges, and Dissolve. So the ones you see here are custom ones that I've created because I use these commands so often. Let me just explain what these commands do. Connect Points, Edges creates new geometry between selected edges and points. You could also just select a single edge and connect it, and this will create a new point right at the center of the edge. Melt and dissolve combine or remove geometry, and well, one of the main differences between these two commands is, for example, if I use melt to remove these edges here, you can see the edges are gone, but if I switch to point mode, you can see the points are still there. So in this case, this is not what I want. So I would use dissolve instead, and this will remove both the edges and the points, as you can see. And you can access these commands by right-clicking in your viewport. So connect edges would be here, dissolve would be here, and melt. It's probably not available in point mode. We need to switch to edge mode probably. So melt would be down here. And I'm going to use the keyboard shortcuts for these commands just to speed things up a bit. Next, I want to split off another area down here where these little holes are going to be. So let's switch to the knife tool again. And I'm still in line mode here, and I have restrict to selection and visible only switched off. Now in this case we can use the geometry that is already there. So I'm just going to snap my knife tool to this point here, hold down my shift key, and make a straight cut like this. And I also want to add another cut right below these shapes in the reference image. Now we can select these edges here and maybe move these down a bit, creating a somewhat even distance between the edges and the shapes in the image here. Next, let's select these two edges here, and I'm using my shortcut to connect these edges. And now I can grab this new edge and use the bevel tool to create these edges. And I've got create Einjoy switched on for the bevel tool here, as you can see. So now we can fine-tune the position if we have to. This edge seems to be positioned perfectly, so I'm not going to move it, but this one we need to move a bit to the right and line it up with the center of this circle here. Now let's go ahead and grab these two edges and use the bevel tool again, and let's do an offset of maybe 7 centimeters. Because of the way I'm going to create these round extrusions later on, I want these edges here to form a perfect square. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this number here, and I'm going to use it to overwrite the size on the x-axis. And I'm going to do the same thing over here. Now let's create the geometry for these two big holes here. And these ones I want to do a little differently, so I'm not going to create any further sections up here. I'm going to switch to polygon mode and just delete this Einjoy here. And next I'm going to create a disk object, and I want to change the orientation of this disk to -z, and now we can just move it along the y-axis and along the x-axis to roughly put it into position up here. Let's go back to our front view, and I'm going to change the display to wireframe here. let's line this up a little more accurately. And I'm going to change the outer radius to 50 centimeters for now. And we only need one disk segment. And we also need to reduce the number of rotation segments because we're going to use hyperNURBS later on. We don't need that many rotation segments. So let's go ahead and use maybe 12. And I think we need to increase the outer radius a bit to maybe 52 centimeters. And actually, I want to make this even a little bigger. Let's do something like 55. I'm going to use these outer edges as my control edges later on, and we can then use extrude inner on the polygons to create the edges where the actual hole starts. Now let's go ahead and create a copy of this disk. In release 13 and 14 you can do that by holding down the control key, left clicking and dragging on one of the axes, for example. So I'm going to line this up with this circle in my reference image, and let's reduce the radius a bit. Okay, and 35 looks about right. But again, I want to make this just a little bit bigger. Let's do maybe 37 here. So now we can select both of these disk objects and make them editable. And I want to connect these disks with the outer frame. But I want to make sure that I keep the name of the outer frame as well as the properties of the phone tag. So what I need to do is select both of these objects here and drag them below the outer frame in the object manager. And if I connect these three objects here, the resulting object will inherit the name and other properties of the object that is at the top here. Before I connect these objects, I want to get rid of these UV tags. Okay, so now let's select these three objects and right click and select Connect Objects and delete from the menu here. And Cinema 4D adds this extension point 1. I'm just going to delete that. So now we need to close this hole again, and we could try to use Mesh Create Tools Close Polygon Hole. And we can close this hole, but if I select this new polygon here, you can see it's not connected to the rest of the geometry. So unfortunately, that's not really an option. What we could do is go to Edge Mode and use the Bridge tool, which is B on your keyboard, or you could right click and select the Bridge tool from the menu here. And we could try and bridge some of the edges here. But the problem is that we don't really have enough geometry up here and over here. So what happens is that we get overlapping geometry. So in order to be able to bridge edges and not run into problems like this one, we're going to have to create some geometry first. I'm going to use my knife tool here and add just a couple of cuts. Let's add one here and one over here, one over here, and another one down here. And I'm going to cut right down to this edge here. Now let's grab the Bridge tool again, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to just randomly bridge some of the edges here, making sure that I don't get overlapping geometry, and later we can use Close Polygon Hole to close the remaining gaps. So let's do something like this, and maybe let's bridge these edges up here. And now we can use MD, which is the shortcut to bring up the Close Polygon Hole tool, and we can start closing these holes here. Just to make sure that we don't have any problems, I'm going to select these polygons and hit UY on the keyboard to grow the selection, and everything looks okay. So that's good. And now what I want to do is get rid of some of the geometry again. Okay, so I'm going to select these polygons here, and we can use either dissolve or melt, which you can't see because it's outside of the recording screen. So again, mesh commands melt. I'm going to use dissolve here. And now let's go ahead and select all of these polygons, and I'm going to use dissolve again to turn these into one big n-gon for now. Okay, so now we can take care of this section down here. Let's go back to our front view, and I'm going to use my knife tool again. Switch it back to plane mode and make sure the plane is still set to XZ. So I'm going to add a few more cuts, and again I'm going to offset these cuts from the edges in my reference image. Something like this. And I also want to split off the area down here where these rectangular details are, so I'm going to add 2 more cuts here. And next we need to add some vertical cuts, so we need to switch the plane to YZ, and to make sure we don't cut into these sections up here, we also need to switch on restrictor selection. And in order for this to work, we also need a selection, of course. So I'm going to switch to edge mode here and grab all of these edges. And now we can use the knife tool and add further cuts here. Okay, so now we can select some of these edges down here and move them up a bit. And again, the idea here is to create a somewhat even distance between the edges in my reference image and the edges on the model here. And maybe I'll move these edges down, space them apart from this circular shape here a bit. And I want to grab all of these edges and use my scale tool to scale them on the x-axis. And now we can create, let me undo that, and now we can create further sections here. So I'm going to select these 2 edges, and I'm going to use edge cut. Left click in my viewport, holding down my left mouse button, I'm dragging to the right to create 2 subdivisions here to create 3 separate areas. And next I'm going to dissolve these edges here because I don't need these right now. Now let's take care of this area over here. We could select these edges and connect them, grab this new edge and move it up a bit. And I'm going to, let's move this up a little further maybe. And now let's select these edges and connect them, and we can select this edge and line it up with this circle in the reference image, and we could use the bevel tool. Let's do an offset of maybe 13 centimeters here. And like before, I want these edges here to form a perfect square. So I'm going to copy this number here and overwrite the size on the x-axis. Next we need to add some geometry over here on the side. If you take a look at this render, you can see that this L-shaped extrusion extends all the way over to the side here, and it's about flush with this corner extrusion here, so we need some geometry over here. And we also need some geometry to define this extrusion on the side here. Now we don't need to add any more geometry up here because we already have this edge or these edges here. So we've got this top covered, but we need some more geometry running vertically, and we also need some more geometry down here. You can see this extrusion ends down here and is approximately flush with the skirting board, so we need some more edges down there. So in edge mode, I'm going to use my ring selection tool and grab these edges, and I want to use edge cut, and left click in my viewport, drag to the left while holding down the left mouse button to create this one subdivision. So I'm going to create this edge loop right at the center of these polygons for now. And if you select these edges here where the extrusion on the corner will be, you can see that the size is 46 by 58 centimeters, and I need this to be square. So what I'm going to do is copy the size of the edges on the x-axis, so Control C, and next I'm going to use my loop selection to select the edges we've just created. And now we also need to select any one of the edges here on the front, and because I've already got my loop selection active here, I'm just going to add this loop. But you could use any one of these edges on the front here. So now I'm going to grab my scale tool, and I need to move the modeling axis to -100% on the z-axis so that it is right at the front of the outer frame. And now we can just overwrite the size on the z-axis by pasting the number we copied earlier. And now we have something that is square. Okay, 46.2 by 46.2 centimeters in my case here. So next I want to grab my ring selection tool again and select these edges. We need to add further edges to define the border of the extrusion that's going to be on the side here. I'm going to use my edge cut tool again, just left clicking once this time to create this new edge loop, again right at the center of these polygons. Now there's one more thing we need to do, so let's grab the knife tool again and switch the plane to XZ and make sure we switch off restrict to selection. We need to add one more cut somewhere down here. And right now I don't really know where these edges need to be on the y-axis, but that's not a problem because we can always move these to wherever we need them to be when we have the skirting board. And that's it for this lesson. Now we've got all the geometry we need to start extruding the actual details, and we're going to do that in the next lesson.